Well, hey there. Look who just stumbled into CRYPTID'S den. If you're new here, don't worry. We're mostly harmless. And if you've been here before, you already know the weird and wonderful ride you're in for. Hope your day's been decent, or at least caffeinated. Drop a comment to say hi and tell me where you're watching from. And hey, don't be shy. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the madness. Now let's get into it. I said I was making it up, that it was just an imaginary friend. But I swear to you, Bigfoot was real. And he was the only one who ever truly saw me. I was 11. My mom didn't believe me. The kids at school made sure I never forgot I didn't belong. I used to cry in silence, wishing anyone would care. And then I met him. He didn't speak. He didn't run. He just looked at me with the saddest, kindest eyes I had ever seen. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Seen, heard, loved. This isn't a story about proving Bigfoot exists. It's about the one creature who, without a single word, reminded me I was human, when no one else did. Based on a powerful film that's brought thousands to tears, this story will make you believe again, not in monsters, but in compassion. If you've ever felt invisible, like your pain didn't matter, this is for you. Watch till the end. It might just remind you, you still matter. You always did. I was 11 the first time I realized I could disappear even when someone was looking straight at me. We were crossing the Sound from Maple Hollow to Rainier Island, and the windows of the ferry were smeared with salt and fog. Mom and Vic sat across from me, sipping coffee and laughing too loud, like they were trying to sound like a happy family. I stared out the glass, chin propped on my arm, and I remember wishing the wind would carry me somewhere else. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere where someone might actually notice if I stopped talking. Somewhere in the cedar thickets along the shoreline. Something moved. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light. The boat tilting slightly, the fog playing with the edges of the trees. But then it didn't move like a shadow. It stood, tall, broader than anyone I'd ever seen, covered in something dark, fur maybe. But it was the eyes that locked me still. Amber, golden almost, and looking straight at me from the tree line. Not through me, at me. I blinked, and it was gone. "Ellie," Mom said, waving a hand in front of my face. "You listening?" I turned away from the glass. "I saw something in the trees," Vic chuckled under his breath. "Was it another one of your wild raccoons or the ghost owl again?" "It wasn't an owl. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. They never listened anyway." "Well, Mom sighed, not unkindly. "Maybe let's not get carried away this time, okay?" I didn't answer. I just looked back out at the shoreline, but the trees were slipping behind us now. Later, while we waited in the line of cars to drive off the ferry, an old man shuffled up beside our truck, leaning on a cane made of twisted wood. He looked right at me through the window, then smiled like he knew me. I don't know why, but my skin prickled under my shirt. He tapped on the glass once, real soft, and when I rolled it down just an inch, he leaned in and said, "The forest knows who's forgotten, little one. And sometimes it sends someone to watch, just to make sure." Then he was gone. The road to the Winslow cabin curved up through thick evergreens, and by the time we pulled into the gravel drive, the sky had gone pale with early evening. Their place hadn't changed much. An old frame with peeling paint, and the same crooked wind chimes made of bottle caps and spoons clinking in the breeze. Ruby and Lacey's mom came out to greet us, all lipstick and fake cheer. The girls barely glanced at me from the porch steps. Lacey gave a tight smile. Ruby didn't even bother. "We set Ellie up in the tent out back," Mrs. Winslow said, clapping her hands. "I didn't want to sleep out there again. Last summer, the girls had whispered about bears and snakes and pushed the sleeping bags so I was at the edge, closest to the wind. I told Mom, quietly, just the two of us beside the car. "I want to stay inside this year," I said. "Please." She was already pulling her overnight bag from the trunk. "Ellie, we talked about this. I wanted to tell her I wasn't scared of the woods. I was scared of the silence. The tent was smaller than I remembered. Green canvas sagged in one corner, and the zipper stuck halfway up. Inside was a flashlight, a musty sleeping bag, and a battered copy of Ye Charlotte's Web. I sat cross-legged and unzipped my backpack. The apple I'd packed that morning was still bruised but edible. I took a bite, then set it down beside my socked foot and listened to the trees sway beyond the thin canvas wall. The wind here didn't sound the same as back home. It was softer, slower, like it was carrying something with it. A hum, a rhythm, or maybe I was just tired. That night, as the last of the light dipped under the trees, I sat by the tent flap and watched the dark crawl in. The Winslows had gone inside for dinner, and I hadn't been invited. I heard dishes clinking and bursts of laughter. No one noticed I hadn't followed. No one asked if I was hungry. So I sat, tracing lines in the dirt with a stick, drawing little spirals and hearts and stars just to pass the time. That's when I heard it. 3 sharp whistles from somewhere just beyond the trees. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. It didn't sound like a bird. It was too measured. I tilted my head, curious, and after a moment I whistled back. Not perfectly, just something close. Then it came again. 4 whistles, slower, softer, almost playful. The hair on my arms stood up, but I didn't feel afraid. I felt seen, like something out there had been watching, waiting for me to notice. I picked up the apple and rolled it toward the trees just to see. I didn't sleep well. The wind kept tapping against the canvas, and I dreamed of tall shapes standing between trees, eyes like lanterns flickering gold. Once, I woke to the sound of leaves crunching softly outside, and I swore I saw a silhouette cast against the back of the tent. Huge, still, listening. But in the morning, the air smelled like cedar, and the birds were already fighting over worms. I unzipped the flap and blinked into the daylight. The apple was gone. In its place was a small bundle of wildflowers, carefully knotted together with a piece of grass. And beside them, nestled in the dirt where my stick drawings had been, was a polished black stone in the shape of a heart. No footprints, no sound, no explanation, just that quiet kind of presence that made you feel, for the first time in a long time, like maybe you weren't as invisible as everyone said. Mrs. Winslow greeted us with her usual tight smile, the kind that doesn't reach her eyes. She ushered Mom and Vic into the house, talking about iced tea and salmon, acting like this was just another easy summer gathering. Ruby and Lacey barely nodded in my direction before vanishing inside, arms linked, already whispering. I stayed by the car, pretending to dig for something in my backpack until the screen door creaked shut behind them. The tent was pitched a little farther back this time, near the edge of the Winslow's tree line, where the lawn faded into a narrow fringe of cedar and fern. It sagged at one corner, lopsided, like it didn't really want to be here either. Someone had laid out a cheap foam mat and a fresh sleeping bag, probably to look like a gesture of kindness, but I knew it was just to avoid complaints. From this distance, the house felt like another world altogether. Warm, lit, full of noise I wasn't part of. I wandered a few paces into the tree line and sat at the base of the cedar that curved outward like a sheltering wing. It smelled of wet bark and old rain. I traced a finger along the grooves in the trunk. This was the kind of quiet I could live inside. Behind me, the Winslow porch light flickered on, and through the thin branches, I caught sight of Mrs. Winslow standing at the sink. Her voice carried, sharp, tired. Chart told the girls to put up with her for a few hours. That's all. She's not our responsibility. Something in my chest folded in on itself. I should have stopped listening, should have walked back to the tent, but I couldn't move. I was so still, I could hear my own heartbeat. Then Mom's voice, tight and low. She's not a bad kid, just too much sometimes. That was the part that stayed with me, not the mosquitoes. That one sentence. When they both started laughing, I stood and walked deeper into the tree line. Not far, just far enough so the house didn't exist anymore. The woods were dim even with the light still lingering in the sky. There was a kind of hush here that pressed down into your skin. Every twig snap felt deliberate. Every shift in the breeze sounded like a whisper. I didn't know if it was the weight of their words or something else, but I suddenly felt watched again. Not by the kind of watching that makes your skin crawl, but the kind that sees all the things people miss. I sat cross-legged in the moss and pressed my palm into the earth. It felt cold, damp. I took the little black heart-shaped stone from my jacket pocket and placed it on the ground in front of me. Something about that made me feel less alone. Then I heard it. Not far. A sound like someone blowing a soft, long whistle. 3 tones. Like the night before, but deeper this time. Almost like it was responding to a memory we both shared. I held my breath, waited. When I whistled back, there was a long pause. Then 4 notes came in reply. I didn't run. Instead, I stood, brushed dirt from my knees, and stepped back toward the clearing. Just before the trees broke, I looked down. The earth there was soft from last week's rain, and in the center of the trail was a footprint, longer than my forearm, wider than both my feet put together. 5 toes, no shoe tread. Deep, like whoever made it was heavy. It wasn't there when I walked in. My heart was thudding against my ribs as I stepped around it. Not out of fear. Not really. I didn't feel hunted. I felt like something had left that mark on purpose. Back at the tent, the inside was hot and airless. The zipper still stuck halfway up. I yanked at it until it gave, then slipped inside. There was no flashlight this time, just the dimming light filtering through the canvas. I found my book, but the words swam. My mind kept going back to the shape in the dirt, to the sound of the whistles, to how quiet the forest had gone afterward. Like even the birds were listening. The rest of the evening dragged. I didn't go inside for dinner. No one came to find me. The house behind the trees glowed like a lantern someone forgot to blow out. Later, the screen door slammed. Tires crunched on gravel. I peeked out through the tent flap and saw Mom and Mrs. Winslow pulling out of the driveway together, their laughter muffled behind rolled-up windows. Mom waved toward the yard like she thought I was watching from somewhere closer. Then they disappeared down the road. No note, no explanation. The porch lights clicked off. Ruby and Lacey were gone too. I heard them say earlier they were spending the night at their friend's cabin. That left just me and the dark, and whatever else might have been moving between the trees. I stepped outside the tent again, this time barefoot, the grass cool and slick beneath my feet. The wind had picked up a little. The branches rustled above like an invisible crowd shifting in their seats. I went to the base of the cedar again, the one that curved like a question. I sat and waited. I don't know for what. What came instead was silence. Thick. Immense. The kind that fills your ears until your own breathing sounds too loud. I reached into my hoodie and pulled out the red apple I'd saved from breakfast. I set it down at the tree's base, just as I had before. Then I whispered, so low I barely heard myself. You can come closer if you want. I won't tell, and I meant it, because the truth was, I'd never felt more alone with people than I did in that house. But whatever was out there, it hadn't turned away. It hadn't lied. It hadn't left. I crawled back into the tent and pulled the flap shut behind me. I lay still, listening for movement, for the sound of grass brushing under heavy feet. But all I heard was the trees breathing and the slow, quiet press of something just beyond the edge of knowing. Something that was still out there and watching. The wind picked up just after midnight. I'd been lying there curled in the sleeping bag, pretending the hum of the woods was enough to quiet the ache in my chest. The tent walls fluttered every so often, not from storms, but from some slow, patient breathing in the trees. I wasn't afraid, not in a way most kids would be, left alone like that. Not anymore. It had started to feel like whatever was out there didn't want to hurt me. It just didn't want me to feel forgotten. The Winslow house was dark, and so was every window in sight. The porch light had burned out sometime around 10, and even the distant sound of the radio they used to leave on was gone. Just me, the trees, and that old tent that smelled like damp plastic and pine needles. I stared at the slant of shadows overhead, branches dancing across the canvas like they had something to say but couldn't find the words. That's when I heard it, rustling, not far off. Just beyond the fire pit that hadn't been lit since the night we arrived. Something moved in a circle, wide enough to stay out of reach, but not out of sight if I looked at the right moment. The kind of movement that didn't belong to squirrels or raccoons or any of the usual nighttime critters. It was heavy, grounded. A step, then stillness. A pause, like it was waiting for me to make a sound. I held my breath and turned off the flashlight. The dark folded in. My eyes strained. And then I caught it, a glint, not of light, but of shape. A ridge, a silhouette broader than the entrance to the tent itself. Knees bent, crouched low, watching. My fingers closed around the zipper, just enough to create a crack I could see through. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It was too big to be a man. Taller even while hunched than Vic standing straight. I remember the slope of its shoulders, the impossible stillness, and most of all, the way the outline seemed to soften into the dark, like it belonged there more than I ever had. I didn't scream. I didn't even flinch. I whispered. It moved then, slow and careful, never breaking eye contact. If that's what it was, a slow shift of weight, a single step back into the trees, not retreating, not fleeing, just giving space. I'm here. I'm real, but I won't force you. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart hammering, but not from fear. From something else. Something heavier. Like the way it feels when someone touches your shoulder, not to warn you, but to say, I see what they didn't. And then I did something I don't think I even decided to do. I unzipped the flap, pushed it aside, and stepped out barefoot into the cold, damp grass. The air smelled of moss and something older. Earthy, wild, but not unpleasant. I looked around, slow and deliberate. Like I was the one making sure Hay wouldn't be scared. He wasn't there, but I felt him still. The way you feel a storm pressing against your skin before the first drop falls. I walked to the tree line, the one where I'd left the apple, where I'd sat earlier and whispered into nothing. I knelt down, ran my hand over the dirt where I'd seen the print. It was gone, but not empty. A small pile of twigs had been arranged carefully in a spiral. At the center, a smooth oval rock, perfectly balanced on its edge. It looked like it should have fallen, should have rolled or tipped over, but it didn't. I didn't dare touch it. Behind me, something exhaled. Not the wind, not the trees. My chest, rising and falling. Not close enough to startle, but close enough to feel in my spine. I turned slowly, every muscle in my back stretched tight. Nothing. And still, the feeling remained. Back in the tent, I didn't try to sleep. I pulled the sleeping bag around my shoulders and sat with my back to the canvas, facing the opening. If he came back, I wanted to be ready. Not to run, not to hide, to acknowledge, to say with my eyes what no one in that house would say with words. Thank you. And I realized, for the first time, that the ache in my chest had changed shape. It wasn't just loneliness anymore. It was connection. Quiet, unspoken, but there. The hours passed slow. My watch read 3:17 a.m. when I heard the whistle. 4 notes, faint and drawn out, like a lullaby made just for me. I didn't answer. I just smiled, even in the dark, and let it settle. In the morning, sunlight leaked through the trees in long, thin blades. I unzipped the flap and stepped into dew-soaked grass. The pile of twigs was still there, untouched. The oval stone still stood, like it hadn't moved an inch, but there was something else now. At the base of the cedar tree, my cedar tree, someone had laid a small circle of wildflowers. Not scattered, arranged. Purple asters, white clover, and something golden I didn't know the name of. In the center, a piece of torn cloth, folded small. My missing sock. The one that dropped near the fire pit the first night. It was clean. I picked it up, fingers trembling. Not because I was scared. Because I knew no animal, no person I'd ever met would do something like this. Whoever he was, he didn't just watch. He understood. He saw the things no one else did. And I think that's when I stopped feeling sorry for myself. Not because I was suddenly strong, but because I wasn't invisible anymore. Not to him. I looked up at the trees and whispered, "I see you too." Then I turned and walked slowly back to the tent, not bothering to zip the flap shut behind me. Let the wind come in. Let him know I wasn't hiding. Not anymore. By the time the sun dropped behind the trees, the house had slipped into silence again. No music. No screen door slamming. Not even the faint rattle of utensils from the kitchen. I could still hear the soft hum of insects in the distance and the steady shuffle of wind across the tops of the cedars. But everything human had gone quiet. I stayed in the tent for a while, waiting to see if anyone would remember I hadn't been fed since lunch. No one came. The lantern I'd rigged from an old flashlight in a plastic cup was flickering, its batteries sagging, and the air inside the canvas walls had grown thick with the heat of the day, stale and heavy. Eventually I gave up and crawled out into the yard, my stomach twisting from more than just hunger. I stood still for a second, taking in the darkness. The windows of the Winslow cabin were all black. I knew Ruby and Lacey had gone to their friend's house for a sleepover. That much they'd made very clear, loud enough for me to hear. Which meant the only people left inside were the ones who never remembered to leave the door unlocked. I tried anyway. Walked up the short stone path, climbed the porch steps, and reached for the knob. Locked. I knocked twice. Nothing. I knocked again. Louder this time, then leaned in. Louder this time, then leaned in, listening for movement. Still nothing. A hard knot formed in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was something colder. That dull, familiar confirmation that I didn't matter enough to be remembered. I turned and climbed back down the steps, the gravel biting at my bare feet, the porch light dead above me. The night had settled deep by then, one of those hushed, unmoving nights where even the wind feels like it's holding its breath. I crossed the yard slowly, flashlight in hand, but didn't turn it on. It felt wrong somehow, too harsh, like headlights in a church. Instead, I stepped carefully, watching the ground until I reached the line of trees. The moon was thin, and the light didn't reach far, but I knew the trail now. The cedar that curved like a question was still there, its bark cool beneath my hand. I ducked behind it and crouched down, not sure why. Maybe out of instinct, maybe because it felt like a kind of ritual by now. I wasn't alone. I didn't see him at first, just the outline of a shape beyond the branches, broad. Still, taller than any person should be. My heart stuttered once in my throat. But I didn't run. I didn't even move. I just sat there, eyes locked on the dark where he stood. He was watching. I could feel it the same way you feel someone's eyes on your back before you turn. Then he shifted. Just a little. Enough for me to make out the slope of his shoulders, the rise of his chest. He wasn't hiding. He was standing guard, and I knew, without needing a reason, that he had been there the whole time. I reached slowly into the pocket of my hoodie, pulled out a piece of bread I'd taken from the breakfast table earlier that morning, and placed it gently on the moss beside me. I didn't say anything. I just placed it there and leaned back. He didn't take a step, didn't make a sound. But I swear, I saw his chest lift and fall just once, like an answer. Something cracked behind me, sharp and fast, like a twig under a boot. I turned. Nothing, but the sound was real, and it wasn't close enough to be mine. I glanced back toward him, and that's when I saw it. The smallest motion. He turned his head slowly, eyes fixed on the trees to our left, watching something I hadn't yet noticed. Another sound came then, from deeper in the woods. Not a twig, not a bird, a voice, low, garbled, then gone. He moved, not fast, not loud, but in 3 strides he was no longer in the clear, just vanished, like the shadows swallowed him whole. I sat frozen for a moment, unsure whether to follow or run. Then I heard the voice again, closer now. A man's laugh, rough and thin. Not joyful, not kind. It came from the direction of the back trail, the one that led toward the river where the locals sometimes camped. But it wasn't just one voice this time. 2, maybe 3. I ducked low, heart thudding. Whoever they were loud. Drunk, maybe. The way their boots slammed into the underbrush didn't match the careful hush of someone who belonged to the forest. Then, out of nowhere, everything went quiet again. No footsteps, no voices, just gone. I waited, listened. That's when I felt the air shift behind me. Warm breath touched the back of my neck. I didn't turn. I couldn't. I just sat there, frozen. Every hair on my arms lifting. A hand, massive and covered in hair, reached around me and slowly pushed the piece of bread back into my lap. Not angrily, not in fear, just giving it back. And then, just as slowly, it was gone again. I sat there for what felt like an hour before I dared to stand. Back in the tent, the light had died completely. I crawled inside and pulled the sleeping bag tight around me, the piece of bread still in my lap. I held it there, like it meant something. Like it proved I wasn't imagining things. In the morning, when the birds started their racket, I opened my eyes to sunlight breaking through the trees. I stepped outside, stretching my legs, and made my way toward the cedar. At its base, a small stack of flat stones had been carefully arranged. Not haphazard. Deliberate. Balanced in a shape I'd only seen in school books, like a cairn, a marker, maybe even a message. Next to it, half buried in the dirt, was the polished black stone I'd thought I lost 2 nights ago. It had been returned. No note, no noise, just a presence, quiet, respectful. I looked toward the woods and whispered, "Thank you." Something moved, far enough that I couldn't see it, but close enough that I felt it. I didn't need to see him to know he was still there, still watching, still latching, still listening. It was just after 3 when I woke up. Not from a dream, not from cold or hunger, just that kind of waking that feels pulled from someplace deep and urgent, like the world outside your skin is holding its breath and needs you to know. I sat up inside the tent, blinking into the dark, and listened. At first there was nothing, just the familiar static of night. Wind sliding through branches, the far-off hiss of leaves brushing leaves, some insect clicking in rhythm. But then it came again, a sound so low I thought I might have imagined it. A breath. Ragged. Not quite human. Something sniffed near the wall of the tent. Something big. I froze. The nylon rustled from the outside. A gentle push like someone tracing the outline of my shoulder. Then silence again. Not gone. Waiting. I reached for the flashlight, fingers fumbling in the sleeping bag, but stopped halfway. Part of me didn't want to shine light in that direction. Not because I was afraid of what I'd see, but because I didn't want it to leave. I whispered, "I'm still here." And then, bold and clumsy and trying to feel brave, I slapped my palm against the inside of the tent wall. Not hard, just enough to say, "I see you too." What happened next was not what I expected. A deep, guttural roar shook the trees like a sudden thunderclap. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a howl. It was something stranger, sadder, angrier, The tent walls bowed inward, lifted by the wind or the force of the sound. I couldn't tell. And then I felt it. The ground shifted beneath me. The tent rope snapped loose, and suddenly I was airborne. For a second, I couldn't tell which way was up. The tent buckled, flipped, folded in on itself like a crumpled lunch sack. And when it hit the ground again, I hit with it. Hard, my head bouncing against something sharp. Maybe a root. The world spun. My breath caught, then another slam. This time the tent was being dragged. I could feel it moving. Fast. Dirt scraping beneath me. The pressure of fingers, or something like fingers, gripping the fabric. I screamed. It wasn't controlled or brave. It was the kind of scream that just rips out of you before you know it's coming. A sound I hadn't made since I was 5, when my dad died. A sound I thought I'd buried. Lights flared behind me. Lights flared behind me. Voices exploded into the night. Let her go. Someone yelled, "Vic!" Footsteps thudded across the yard. Then another voice. "Mrs. Winslow, higher, shriller." Oh my God. The tent dropped, just like that. No slow release, no careful hand. I hit the ground with a thud, tangled in canvas and zipper and leaves, barely able to crawl free. My knees scraped raw on the gravel. My elbow stung from where I must have landed wrong. I looked up. He was standing at the edge of the trees, not running, not hiding, just standing there, shoulders heaving, eyes locked on me. And for the first time I saw him fully. The moon had cleared the clouds. The porch light flickered to life behind Vic as he came running toward me. But my gaze stayed fixed on the creature in the trees. 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in fur the color of old bark, arms longer than any man's, but not clumsy. Graceful in a way that felt ancient. And the eyes. Those same amber eyes. Not wild, not dumb. Tired. Human in a way that made my chest cave in. He didn't roar again. He didn't move. He looked at me. Then he turned and stepped backward into the dark, not crashing through, just fading, slow and sure, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. And then he was gone. Vic reached me, breathless, grabbing my arm. "Are you okay? Ellie, answer me." I blinked at him. I couldn't find the words, not because I was hurt, but because I didn't want to let go of what I'd just seen. I didn't want them to ruin it with fear or explanations. Mrs. Winslow hovered behind him, hands over her mouth, eyes darting toward the woods. What in the hell was that? I stood up slowly, shaking bits of pine needles from my shirt, and looked toward the line of trees. He didn't mean to hurt me. Neither of them responded. The others came then. Neighbors, I guess, roused by the lights and shouting. Someone brought a blanket. Someone else wanted to call the sheriff. There were more flashlights now, sweeping the yard, dancing across my overturned tent like it was a crime scene. No one looked toward the forest for long. Maybe they were afraid of what they might see, or maybe they were afraid of what they already believed. Eventually, Mom showed up. Hair wild, slippers on, mascara streaked like she'd been crying, or yelling, maybe both. She wrapped me in her arms and said my name like it was a question, like she didn't know who I was. I let her, for a little while. But when she asked me what happened, I looked her right in the eye and said, he was protecting me. No one believed me. But no one tried to say I was lying either. And that silence, the way they avoided my eyes, the way they whispered just out of earshot, that told me everything I needed to know. They were afraid. Not just of him, but that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't made it all up. And I think he knew that too, because from deep in the woods just before they dragged me inside, I heard one final sound. Not a roar, not a growl, a whistle. 4 notes, slow, steady, and then nothing but trees. The living room smelled like burnt coffee and plastic. Someone had turned on all the lights, and it made everything feel harsher than it already was. Every face too bright, every voice too loud. I sat on the edge of the old corduroy couch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, even though I wasn't cold anymore. Vic was pacing in tight circles, muttering to himself about search parties and cameras. Mrs. Winslow stood by the kitchen island, pouring another drink with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. And Mom just sat across from me, her legs crossed, staring at nothing. Nobody had said his name, not that he had one, but they all knew what I meant when I said he was protecting me. And that silence afterward was more terrifying than any roar in the woods could have been. Eventually, Vic snapped. "Protecting you? That thing threw you across the yard? Ellie!" "He didn't throw me," I said, barely above a whisper. "He dropped the tent, that's all." "He dropped the tent?" He barked. "Like that makes it better?" Mom didn't speak. Her fingers played with the edge of a napkin, folding it over and over, until it looked like it might rip. Then Mrs. Winslow set her glass down with a loud clink. "You all need to stop." Her voice wobbled but tried to sound firm. "This isn't something we're going to let get out of hand. No more stories. No more talk of monsters. It's over." I looked at her, and for a second, something in me wanted to believe that maybe she was scared too. But then she added, "You brought this on yourself." The words landed like stones in my chest. Vic stopped pacing. "What the hell does that mean?" Mrs. Winslow shook her head. "It means maybe if you'd kept better track of your daughter, we wouldn't be standing here trying to explain why there are boot prints the size of trash can lids in our backyard." "I didn't imagine those," I said quietly. "Ellie," Mom finally said, her voice strained. "Please don't start again." I turned to her. "Start what?" Telling the truth. She looked at me like she wanted to reach out, but didn't know how. Maybe never had. "It's just a lot right now." "That's always your answer." She flinched. I didn't apologize. Vic started to argue again, but then Bob Winslow stormed through the front door with a flashlight in hand and mud on his shoes. "Okay," he said, breathing hard. "I checked the perimeter. There's more tracks leading out toward the river. Deep. Real deep." "It wasn't a bear. Not unless bears wear their feet like shoes." "No one said bear," I murmured. He paused, looked at me, and for the briefest moment, I thought he might actually say what everyone else was afraid to. But instead, he looked at Sue, then at Mom, and muttered, "This area's had reports before. You know that. You just didn't want to believe it. You said they were hoaxes," she shot back. I said I wasn't sure. "That's different." Mom stood abruptly. "We're leaving tonight," Vic blinked. "No?" "Yes," she said, and her voice was so cold I barely recognized it. "Get the bags." No one argued. No one tried to stop her. Not even Mrs. Winslow, who had already turned her back on the room and started clearing the untouched glasses. I followed them outside, my shoes crunching over the gravel. The tent was still crumpled where it had landed, the nylon torn in one place, the poles bent. A few of my things were scattered. My flashlight, the half-empty notebook, the heart-shaped stone. I bent down, brushing dirt from its surface, and slipped it into my pocket. I knew we wouldn't be back. The drive was long and silent, broken only by the hum of tires on wet pavement and the occasional click of Mom's turn signal. No one spoke, not even when we pulled off the highway and checked into a roadside motel with buzzing fluorescent lights and a smell like old soap. I lay awake most of that night. Vic snored from the bed closest to the door. Mom's back was to me, her shoulder blades rigid under the blanket. I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember every detail of his face. Not the fur, not the size, just the way he looked at me, like I mattered. In the morning, while they packed up, I sat alone at the edge of the parking lot, watching the trees beyond the fence. I wanted to believe he had made it back safely, that he knew I hadn't meant to bring chaos to it, that he knew I hadn't screamed because I was afraid of him. I reached into my pocket and found the stone again. Smooth, solid, real. Later that day, back at the house, Mom made me promise not to talk about it. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She just sat me down and said, "People won't understand. They'll think you're making it up, and you've had enough of that in your life already." I stared at her and asked, "Do you believe me?" She looked down at her hands and didn't answer, and that told me everything. So I said nothing, but I kept the stone, and I remembered the sound of his breath, the way he turned to shield me, even as the others yelled and pointed and lit him up like something to be feared. He could have hurt me. He didn't. He could have run the first night. He didn't. And even now, even after everything, I still didn't know why he came to me at all, but I knew what it felt like to be seen, to be chosen, not as a danger, not as a burden, just as someone worth showing up for. And that part, no one could make me forget. Some memories don't fade, they ferment. They grow heavier, sharper, and stranger the longer you carry them. That summer didn't leave me the way other summers did. It lodged itself behind my ribs and built walls around what I could no longer explain out loud. People forgot what they wanted to forget, and I learned how to keep quiet. Even when I was screaming on the inside, I smiled when adults asked how school was going. I nodded when they said I seemed so much calmer now. I held it all together until it became second nature, until no one asked anymore. Years passed. The world kept turning like nothing had happened, like a girl being ripped from her tent in the middle of the night and dropped by something taller than any doorway. It was just a campfire story you could laugh off with enough distance. I didn't laugh. Not then. Not now. In high school, I wrote a paper about cognitive dissonance, how people will believe a lie just to keep their own reality from cracking. My teacher gave me an A and asked if I'd ever thought about going into psychology. I remember nodding while thinking, "Lady, you have no idea." I moved away at 18. College, then work. Oregon first, then Colorado. I found quiet places to live, small corners near the edge of forested towns. I liked the distance, the hush of trees, the way animals watched you without judgment. I worked in conservation. No one laughed when I said I felt more at home with moss than I ever did in church pews. People like me tend to find places like that. I didn't talk to my mother much. We kept the kind of distance that feels polite on paper, like birthdays and Christmas cards, and the occasional voicemail that ends in, "Call when you get a chance." We never brought up the Winslow cabin. Not once. That silence was our agreement. My dad's old coat hung in my closet for years. I never wore it, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it out. Inside the inner pocket, I kept the black heart-shaped stone, and the torn sock cloth had returned to me. They smelled like cedar, even after all that time. Like something sacred. It had been over 20 years when the message came. It was an email. Simple, no subject line. The sender's name made my stomach clench. Lacey Winslow. I stared at the screen for 10 full minutes before opening it. "Hey, I don't know if this will even get to you. I heard you work in the conservation field now." "That makes sense. I'm in therapy. Part of it is writing letters I never sent. But this one, I need to. We saw it. That night, Ruby and I. We came back early. We saw him lift the tent. We saw him put you down. We heard you scream and we ran. We didn't tell anyone. We let them think you were crazy because we were too scared to be the crazy ones. I'm sorry. I know you probably hate me. That's okay. I just wanted you to know you weren't alone that night. And you weren't wrong. I didn't respond. I read it a dozen times. And then I closed my laptop and went for a walk through the trees behind my cabin. I stood at the edge of a clearing, one where elk sometimes came at dusk, and I listened. I closed my eyes and let the wind brush past me like breath. I didn't need her apology. Not really. I didn't need validation or closure or any of the things people on TV cry about in living rooms with soft lighting. What I wanted, more than anything, was to believe I hadn't imagined the connection. That it had mattered. That he'd come to me not out of accident, but out of recognition. A few months later, I was volunteering at a children's wilderness camp. A little girl named Avery wouldn't stop staring at the edge of the woods. She didn't talk much. Just drew pictures. Dark shapes behind trees, yellow eyes. Tiny girls holding apples. One night after dinner, she tugged on my sleeve and said, "He comes at night, but only if you're sad and quiet. He doesn't like when people yell." I asked her gently who she meant. She said, "The tall one, the big one. He smells like rocks and warm dirt. He makes the scary things stay away." I didn't ask anything else. I just sat next to her real still and whispered, "I think he's a friend of mine." She looked up at me, and for a second, she didn't look like a child at all. She looked like someone who knew exactly what I meant. That night, I wrote everything down. All of it. Not for a therapist. Not for my mother. For me. Because I wanted it to exist somewhere besides inside my skin. I printed it out and folded the pages into an envelope. I wrote on the front, "Day for the record. For whoever comes next." Then I tucked it into the same pocket as the stone and the cloth, and I placed the coat in a cedar box lined with dried lavender. I keep that box at the back of my closet still. Not hidden, just waiting. Sometimes I think about going back to the Winslow place, to the edge of the clearing, to the cedar that curved like a question. But I don't think I'd find him there. He was never tied to the ground like that. He lived in the spaces people refused to see. And I think the reason he came wasn't because I was brave. It was because I was quiet. Because I was the kind of silence he could recognize. And he was the kind of truth I could carry. I recorded this late, long after the sun dipped past the ridgeline behind my cabin. The crickets are going outside. The kettle's still warm on the stove, and my dog is asleep at my feet. I'm not telling this for attention. I'm not even telling it for belief. I'm telling it because someone should. When I was 11, I learned the kind of fear that doesn't scream. The kind that sits quiet in your bones, reshapes how you breathe. But I also learned something else. Something bigger. Something older than the stories we're allowed to tell out loud. Something that saw me when the people who were supposed to protect me didn't. I've carried that summer my whole life. Not like a burden, exactly. More like a quiet rhythm, always just beneath my skin. I can feel it in my palms when I step into the woods. I can feel it when someone raises their voice and I flinch without knowing why. I can feel it every time a child is interrupted, dismissed, ignored. I think the worst part wasn't what happened. It was that no one wanted to hear it. Not really. They wanted it cleaned up, made manageable. They wanted it rewritten into something polite, something bear-shaped, something easy to explain. But the truth never asked to be easy. I never saw him again after that summer. Not in the way I did then. But I felt him. I felt him standing behind the tree line when I'm walking trails alone. I felt him when I sit at the edge of campfires and the flames bend in a sudden gust. I felt him in the weight of small gifts left where they shouldn't be, in stacked stones, in circles of wildflowers, in prints that don't match any chart. You don't forget someone who looked at you like you were worth staying for. I don't know what he was. I've read all the theories. I've heard all the podcasts. I know the terms. Cryptid, wood ape, North American bipedal hominid. But none of that means anything to me. What I know is this. He chose not to hurt me. He chose not to run. And when the world around me turned its back, he stayed in the dark and watched without turning away. There's something holy in that. And before you scoff, or roll your eyes, or call this folklore, I want to ask you something, not out loud, just quietly, wherever you're listening. Has anyone ever looked at you like that? Like you mattered? Not for what you could offer, not for how well you behaved, not for how pretty you smiled, or how quietly you kept your pain, but just because you were there. If you've never known that look, I hope someday you do. And if you have, I hope you remember it the way I remember him. I don't need anyone to prove he exists. He existed to me. And that's enough. I sent this story in not to convince, but because maybe someone else out there needs to know they're not alone. Maybe some other kid grown now and still carrying a silence that no one ever gave permission to speak, needs to hear that someone else saw something too, needs to know there was someone in the trees and he didn't run. And maybe, just maybe, he's still out there, still listening. If you're watching this, thank you for giving me your time, for sitting through a story that might sound strange or broken or too quiet to matter. I promise you it matters. Not because of monsters or myths, but because what we believe about the world shapes who we choose to be in it. If you have your own story, if there's something you've kept locked away for too long, I hope this gives you the courage to let it breathe. Even just a little. And if you're someone who listens to kids, who really listens, I want to thank you. You're rarer than you know. This is Ellie Dawson. Thanks for being here. Leave a comment if you've ever felt seen by someone, or something, that no one else believed in. And if you're still out there, you know who you are. I never forgot you, and I never will. Sometimes, the things we carry the longest are the ones no one else ever sees. A memory half whispered in the dark. A moment of kindness when no one was watching. A quiet presence that came not to save us, but simply to stay. And perhaps that's what matters most. Not the myths or the mysteries. Not the names we give the unexplainable. But the way someone made us feel when the world had already decided we didn't. There are truths that don't need proof. They just need space. There are wounds that don't bleed, but they shape us all the same. And there are stories. Gentle, strange, impossible stories that live in the corners of our hearts, not to be shouted, but to be remembered. Because sometimes, survival doesn't look like fighting back. Sometimes, it looks like being seen. Sometimes, it looks like silence being answered. Sometimes, it looks like being chosen when no one else did. And maybe the world would be softer if we believed people more when they whisper what they've seen. Maybe we'd listen better. Maybe we'd stop asking for evidence before offering empathy. Whether you believe in the extraordinary or not, there's one thing that's always true. Nobody forgets the moment they stopped feeling invisible. And maybe the real magic isn't in what walked out of the woods, but in what it reminded us about trust, about presence, about the simple, aching human need to matter. Thank you for sitting with this story, for staying through the quiet parts, and for letting it reach you wherever you are. If anything here touched something you've carried too long, or reminded you of something you thought you'd forgotten, I hope you'll take a moment to let it settle. We'd love to hear what it stirred in you. Feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Whether it's something you've seen, something you felt, or simply a moment that changed you. And if you'd like to be part of more stories like this, stories that drift between what's real and what's too true to explain, don't forget to subscribe. There's always more to uncover, more to remember, and maybe more waiting just beyond the tree line.